The dust storms of Castaway Station turned gold before the boy did. That was always the order of things out on that rock. The sky waking up long before the people who worked under it. Doyle had already been up 2 hours by the time the first color touched the dome's eastern seam, mucking out feed pens in the gray half-light with his breath fogging in front of him despite the dome's heating grid, because heating grids on a border outpost never quite reached the floor where a boy's boots actually stood. He flexed his fingers inside gloves that had gone stiff at the knuckles from age and cheap leather, and he didn't stop working to warm them. Stopping cost time, and time on Castaway cost credits, and credits were the only thing standing between him and a worse cot than the one he already had. He was 17, though. People guessed younger from the frame of him, wiry in the way boys get from labor instead of growth spurts. Sandy hair he hacked at himself with a folding blade whenever it crept past his eyebrows. His face had been rounder once, back when it belonged to a kid with 2 parents and a name that meant something beyond a work assignment. 6 years on this moon had planed all the softness off it, sharpened the jaw, hollowed the cheeks just enough that strangers sometimes mistook him for older and treated him accordingly. His eyes were pale gray, his mother's eyes, and they'd lost whatever it was that used to make them crinkle easy at nothing in particular. He didn't spend much time missing that version of himself. Missing things was a luxury for people who had somewhere soft to land when the missing got heavy, and Rennick didn't. He'd been 11 when the transport his parents were riding got flagged as a target by a splinter faction fighting over mining rights 3 systems over, wrong cargo manifest, wrong week, wrong luck. The Colonial Authority had processed his file with the efficiency of people who'd done it 1,000 times before him, paid out a standard bereavement stipend, and routed him to whichever outpost had an opening for cheap, unskilled labor. Castaway Station had an opening. A stock handler named Osgood needed hands more than he needed a son, and Osgood was not a cruel man so much as an empty one. A man who traded every soft edge of himself for efficiency long before Rennick arrived and simply never noticed the trade had cost him anything. He paid fair wages for the region, gave the boy a loft above the draft animals, and otherwise treated him the way you treat any reliable piece of equipment with maintenance, not warmth. Rennick had stopped expecting warmth from him around age 13. It was easier that way. Castaway itself was a trade waypoint, 5 interlocking domes bolted onto a ridge of red rock in the middle of a dust basin that stretched flat and merciless in every direction for hundreds of kilometers. It was the only fixed point of commerce for half that distance, which meant everyone came through eventually, human traders running the outer circuit, Velkari merchants with their careful ledgers, and the green-skinned Thesral warrior clans from beyond the treaty line, whose language sounded to Rennick's ear like stones grinding together underwater. He'd grown up around Thesral caravans the way a kid on Earth might grow up around seasonal weather, a fact of the landscape, present and predictable and never once addressed directly. He'd never spoken to one. He'd felt their eyes on him a handful of times, amber, slip-pot piled, unblinking in a way that made the hair on his arms stand up whether he wanted it to or not, and he'd learned young to look elsewhere until the feeling passed. That particular morning, hauling water buckets across the central concourse for the 3rd run of the day, he watched 2 Thesral caravans roll in through the eastern gate almost back to back. The first was ordinary, 6 wagons, hide cloaks dusted red, a mix of older warriors and a couple of braided-haired women walking escort. The second was not ordinary. Its wagons were draped in dark cloth, its lead banner furled tight against the pole instead of flying loose, and its warriors moved in a formation Rennick had never seen before, tight, deliberate, boxed in around a single covered cart like men guarding something they could not afford to lose twice.
He clocked weather fronts. A habit trained so deep into him it operated below conscious thought, filed it, and kept walking because water didn't haul itself and Osgood didn't pay for observation. He was on his 3rd crossing, the dust starting to warm gold under a climbing sun, when a small hand closed around his sleeve hard enough to nearly spill his buckets. He spun with the reflex of someone who'd learned not to be caught flat-footed on a border world, bucket half raised, and stopped himself half a second before instinct became a mistake. She was standing far closer than any Thesral he'd ever encountered stood to a human. That was the first wrong thing his brain registered, before it even processed who she was. Thesral did not crowd strangers.
They didn't crowd anyone as far as he'd ever seen. The second thing he registered was that she was young, not child young, but not grown either, caught in that narrow window where a person's frame has finished lengthening but hasn't yet filled in. Her skin was a pale sage green, lighter than the caravan warriors he was used to seeing, and a single thick braid of white hair fell over one shoulder, bound at the end with 3 cords of woven leather. Her eyes were amber, wide, vertical pupilled, and scared in a way that hit him before he even had words for it, the specific fear of someone who'd run and wasn't sure yet whether they'd run far enough. "Please," she said, in standard, the accent careful and slightly formal, like someone who'd learned the language from a teacher who took the job seriously. "I've lost my way." Rennick set his buckets down. His sleeve was damp where her hand had gripped it. He scanned the concourse behind her on reflex, no handler, no guardian, nobody watching her, which was itself wrong, because Thesral families did not let their daughters wander a human trade post unescorted. "Lost from who?" he asked, and his voice came out rougher than he meant, still unused that early. "My kinsman, he said to wait by the eastern gate. I waited. He hasn't returned." She glanced over her shoulder, quick, and the movement pulled her sleeve back enough that Rennick caught sight of a woven charm at her wrist, 3 cords, white, gray, and a deep red. He didn't know what it meant. He understood on instinct that it meant something. How long? 2 hours, perhaps more. Did he say where he was going? No. Rennick looked at her. He looked at his buckets. He thought about Osgood, about the dry troughs that would cost him a docked wage if he didn't finish before the second bell. And then he looked back at her face, at the careful set of her mouth, at the way she was clearly hungry and hadn't eaten since well before dawn, and made the decision without fully deciding to make it. "I'm Rennick," he said. She blinked, like she'd expected the question sooner and had already stopped waiting for it. "Vesa," she said, "just Vesa." He let the obvious gap sit unaddressed. There were 100 reasons a Thesral girl might withhold a family name from a stranger in a market, and none of them were his business unless she made them so. "Walk with me," he said, nodding toward the western corridor. "I've got water to finish, then I'll help you find your kinsman. Don't stand out here alone. Not everyone passing through this concourse is someone I'd want near you." She fell into step beside him without another word, and he noticed, the way he noticed weather, that she walked like someone trained since childhood in how to carry herself around strangers. Spine straight, hands loose, gaze forward, but tracking everything at the edges. Halfway across the concourse, she spoke again. "You didn't ask why my kinsman left me. Not my business. Most humans would have asked. I'm not most humans." The words came out almost like a joke, an attempt at one at least, and he caught the corner of her mouth twitch upward before she visibly reined it back in. Her teeth, in that half second, were just slightly too sharp to be human. He filled the eastern troughs while she leaned against a post nearby, and on the way back he spent a credit he genuinely couldn't spare on a cup of sweetened water from a fruit stall vendor, handed it to her, and watched her face when she drank it, the particular focus of someone tasting a thing for the first time and deciding, right then, to remember it. They were standing under the stall's awning when the eastern gate started screaming. The first scream came from a Velkari trader, high and warbling, the specific pitch of a sound made by someone whose surroundings had just stopped being safe. 2 more screams answered it, human ones this time, men who'd never had cause to make that particular noise before and were finding out what it sounded like coming out of their own throats. A warning bell began clanging somewhere in the eastern dome. Beneath it all came something else, a low rolling growl that didn't belong to any throat Rennick had ever heard, followed by the splintering crack of wagon timber giving way under something with real weight behind it. Vesa went rigid beside him. He had just enough time to look at her face before he looked at what was coming, and what he saw there was worse than anything closing in from around the corner. She wasn't surprised. She knew what had gotten loose. Her expression was the look of someone watching an old grief walk back into the room uninvited. "Vesa, get behind me," she said. First in Thesral, low and fast, then again in standard, and her voice had lost every trace of girlhood in it.
It came around the corner of the fruit stall a heartbeat later. Built low and long, the size of a small draft horse, but nothing like 1/6 legs, the front pair longer than the rear, ending in 3-toed feet with a 4th curved claw, held back like a hawk's talon. Black scaled hide running down its spine, fading to dull olive along the flanks, the same shade. Rennick registered somewhere distant and useless as Vesa's skin. Its head was flat and wide, set low on a neck corded with muscle, and its mouth wasn't a mouth so much as a quarter jaw, 4 hooked tusks, paired top and bottom, built to close in one precise crushing bite. Its eyes were old gold and didn't blink.
A Thesral handler came skidding around the same corner 3 strides behind it, blade drawn, shouting words Rennick couldn't understand, but whose tone he understood perfectly. The man wasn't commanding the beast. He was begging it. The animal slowed. It swept its gaze across the concourse with the unhurried consideration of something that hadn't eaten recently and was simply choosing an order. It passed over a frozen trader, a garrison guard fumbling his rifle strap, a stall keeper flattened against his own wall, and stopped on Vesa. Rennick watched its whole body change the instant it locked on her. Muscle bunched forward, whatever passed for ears on that flat skull pinned back. It made the growl again, deeper this time, and something in Rennick's chest recognized, with total clarity, that this was the sound it made right before it moved. He moved first. He didn't decide to. There wasn't a decision in it, not really, just his palm slamming flat between Vesa's shoulder blades, shoving her backward, and his own body stepping into the space she'd just occupied. He turned his back to the beast. He had no weapon. He had 2 cracked leather gloves and a body that had never in its life been trained for anything heavier than a feed sack. And he stood there under a stranger's awning on a moon he hadn't chosen, and put himself between a monster and a girl he'd known for 11 minutes. The strike came fast and low. He'd braced for claws. It didn't claw, it bit. The quarter jaw closing across his left shoulder and the ribs beneath it in one motion. And somewhere under the roar of pain, he heard a small, wet sound that was bone shifting against bone in a direction bone was never meant to shift. The pressure wasn't pain exactly. It was a fact, total and absolute, that it simply replaced his shoulder. It lifted him half off his feet. He didn't fall, because falling meant Vesa was exposed again, and the part of him steering his body in that instant wasn't the part that reasoned things through. The handler arrived at a dead sprint and gave 3 sharp whistled notes. The beast released. Rennick came down hard on his knees in the dust. His left arm hung dead at his side. Heat spread fast across his chest, and somewhere distant he understood it was blood, soaking down through his shirt to his belt. Vesa was already at his side, her green hands red to the wrist, shouting something at the handler in a register Rennick hadn't heard from her before, the kind of tone that made a grown warrior take a step back and drop his eyes. Rennick looked up at her face and thought, in the small, slow corner of his mind not yet going dark, that her eyes were very pretty. Then the boots arrived, dozens of them. Thesral warriors at a dead run, weapons out, calling to each other in a rhythm that sounded almost like a chant. And behind the column, a figure so large the crowd parted for him before he'd even finished a step. He stood close to 7 feet, olive green skin gone weathered stone gray at the throat and wrists from decades under this sun. Half his skull was shaved bare and marked with rows of small dark tattoos Rennick didn't recognize but could guess the weight of the hair on the other side hung in 3 thick iron gray braids past his collarbone, matched by a braided beard of the same color. His eyes were the same amber as Vesa's, with none of the softness. He wore dark lacquered leather, the color of old dried blood, and carried no visible weapon because he plainly didn't need one to be the most dangerous thing on the concourse. Rennick had seen that face on news broadcasts since before he could remember caring. Draven Thren, called the Iron Fist across 3 border systems, the man who had unified 6 warring clans under one banner and then walked into a Federation hearing room and told the assembled senators, in better standard than half of them spoke natively, that his people would honor the treaty exactly as long as the treaty honored them, and not one day past that. He didn't run to his daughter. He walked at a pace that suggested no obstacle on this entire moon was worth hurrying for, and the crowd folded out of his way because human instinct understood things human minds hadn't caught up to yet. He rounded the fruit stall.
He took in the scene in one sweep, his daughter kneeling in the dust with blood on her hands, the boy beside her torn open at the shoulder, the beast standing 5 paces off with its head lowered and its handler already face down in the dirt. He went to his daughter first. He didn't touch her. He crouched, studied her face, asked one short word in Thesral. She answered him in 3. He nodded once. Then his eyes moved to Rennick. The world had started sounding like it was happening in another room by then. The Warlord knelt in close, pressed 2 thick fingers to the wound at Rennick's shoulder, brought them to his own nose, and, strangely, distantly touched them to his lips. He went very still.
Rennick thought in the fading half-light of his own consciousness that this was a strange thing for a man to do. Then the warlord looked up at his daughter, down at Rennick, back at his daughter, a long look that Vesa held without flinching, and finally spoke very quietly in standard. Tell me what happened, she told him in 3 sentences. That she'd been lost. That a stranger had guided her, bought her a drink, asked nothing in return, that the beast had come and the stranger had shoved her clear and taken the bite meant for her. The warlord closed his eyes for one breath, opened them, spoke 3 short words in Thesral, low, and the nearest warriors went still in a way that unsettled the human onlookers more than the beast itself had. The handler in the dirt didn't lift his head. Draven Thren slid one massive arm under Rennick's good shoulder and another beneath his back and lifted him like he weighed nothing at all. Follow, he said over his shoulder, to his daughter and to no one else. He comes with us. The ground moved beneath Rennick. Then it stopped being ground. He caught the scent of oil and leather and cold air. And then there was nothing at all, and nothing lasted a long, long time. He surfaced into a haze of incense and copper and low, murmured voices speaking a language he didn't understand. The light was amber gold, filtered through hide stretched over wooden ribs, a tent, stitched at the seams with sinew, its interior painted in patterns he couldn't make out in the dimness. He was lying on a cot. A dense, cool pressure sat across his chest and shoulder. A dressing packed with something that wasn't water. He flexed his fingers. They worked. He turned his head, slow, and found an elderly Thesral man seated 3 paces off, tying off a small clay jar with a leather cord, not looking up. You should be dead, the old man said in standard so flat it might have been printed on a card. Rennick tried his voice and found it there. Why am I not? That, said the old man, cinching the cord, is the question the entire camp has been asking since yesterday morning. Yesterday? You've slept a day and a half. The venom took hold and worked its way through you. He finally looked up, dark honey-colored eyes that weren't warm but weren't unkind either. The bite carries a toxin we call the Varash. It kills 9 of every 10 Thesral it touches. It has never once spared a human before you. It has now. Rennick shut his eyes and opened them again. The tent was still there. I don't understand. You will, the old man said, rising. You won't enjoy the understanding. Most of us never do. He crossed to the tent flap. Someone is waiting to see you. The flap fell shut behind him, and for one held breath, Rennick was alone. And then it opened again, and Vesa was standing in it. She'd traded the ill-fitting worker's coat for a long dark robe of soft wool, a circlet of braided white cord at her brow. Her hair loose instead of bound. Her face looked like it hadn't slept in longer than a day and a half. She crossed the tent, knelt at his side, and took his hand and didn't let go. You should have run, he said, voice rough. I know. Why didn't you? Because you didn't. She bent and pressed her forehead briefly against the back of his hand. He felt the heat of her skin through his own. When she straightened, her voice had gone very low. There's something I should have told you yesterday. She met his eyes. My name isn't just Vesa. I'm Vesrine Thren, daughter of Draven Thren, of the Ilkar line of Kelvain. He laughed. Not politely, a real involuntary bark that hurt his ribs and didn't stop him from letting it out anyway, because there was nothing else to do with information that large except laugh at it until his eyes watered and he could pretend the tears were only from that. She watched him without offense when he could breathe again. He said, Of course you are. I should have said so sooner. You should have. He wiped his face with his good hand. Your father's coming in now, isn't he? He is. And he won't apologize for any of it. She hadn't let go of his hand when the tent flap opened again and the warlord ducked through, having to bend nearly double to clear the center pole. There was no chair built to hold him, so he stood at the foot of the cot, amber eyes fixed on Rennick's face, the smell of oiled leather filling the tent with him. You can hear me, he said. Good. I'll be brief because you're tired, and what I have to say will tire you further. Rennick didn't answer. There didn't seem to be a response that would help. Draven Thren spoke in slow, deliberate standard. He explained that the beast, a Karak, one of the war-bonded hunting stock kept by several clans, had bitten Rennick, and that its bite carried the Varash, and that by every record his people had ever kept, the venom killed nearly everyone it touched. He explained that those rare few who survived it were called, in the old tongue, Venerii, a word that translated poorly into standard, something closer to true-hearted, though it had nothing to do with virtue in any moral sense. It described a quality the Karak itself could measure and the Thesral could not fully define. He explained that a Korak who bit a Venari was bonded to that person for the remainder of its life. The bond could not be undone by any authority, human or thestral. The beast that had torn open Rennick's shoulder yesterday morning belonged to no handler and no clan any longer. It belonged to Rennick, whether he wanted it or not. That, the warlord said, was the first gift. Rennick opened his mouth to protest. He had no land, no money, nowhere to keep a war beast the size of a horse, and the warlord raised one finger, and the protest died before it formed. It does not matter where you put it, Draven said. It will follow you regardless. There was a second matter. By the law of his people, when a Venari was found to have shielded the warlord's own blood from death, the debt owed could not be settled in metal, in land, or in labor. It could only be settled in name. The warlord stepped to the side of the cot, looked down at Rennick for a long, unreadable moment, and struck him lightly on the chest. Once over the heart, once over the wound, and spoke a formal string of words that Rennick would only fully understand months later. That by the right of the Iron Fist, the outsider Rennick Doyle was from this hour acknowledged as blood of the Thren line. Brother to no living man, son to Draven, and free of debt to every clan under Kelvain's banner. That was the second gift, and Rennick, who had gone 6 years, 4 months, and some number of days he'd stopped counting without a single living parent, didn't have a face ready for what came up out of him at those words. He looked at the man standing over his cot and lost the shape of him behind a blur he couldn't blink away in time. The warlord didn't remark on it. He let it happen, and then turned his gaze to his daughter, who hadn't released Rennick's hand through any of it, and studied her for a long beat. Her chin came up. She didn't look away. There's a third matter. Draven said, Quieter now. I will not order this one. I will only witness it, if it's willed. He spoke of an old custom. The Vorshal, the bond of protector and protected, entered only if both parties chose it freely. Not a marriage, a pledge of intent, breakable only by death or formal release on both sides. He said the words that framed it, and waited. Rennick looked at Vesa. She was already looking at him. Yes, he said, before he'd finished thinking through a single reason not to. Yes, she said, a half beat ahead of him finishing the word. The warlord laid his palm flat across both their chests at once, broad enough to span them both, and held it there for a long, silent count, and something in the tent finally exhaled. That was the third gift. The flap moved before Draven had even lowered his hand, and a young Thestral messenger stepped in with the particular expression of someone delivering news he badly wished belonged to someone else. He spoke 3 quick sentences. The warlord listened without a flicker of reaction, nodded once, and the messenger retreated. The colonial authority has been notified, Draven said, turning back to Rennick. As has the Khazrath clan? Both will arrive before sundown tomorrow. A pause. You will rest until then. After that, you will not rest for some time. He left without another word. Vesa stayed. The colonial delegation arrived first. Commissioner Aldous Price was a lean, silver-templed man in a slate-gray coat, 4 armored troopers trailing him, a data slate under one arm and a legal file thick enough to double as a doorstop under the other. He addressed the receiving tent in a voice trained to make unreasonable requests sound like the most reasonable thing in the galaxy, formally requesting the immediate return of one Rennick Doyle, minor ward of the Colonial Authority, currently held without legal guardian consent. Draven Thren was already waiting for him. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The boy is not the authorities to claim, he said. By the law of my people, witnessed before 200 warriors and the eyes of his own kind, he is mine. If you wish to take him, Commissioner, you may explain to your government that you chose to start the next human-thestral conflict in a market tent on a border moon, and you may explain it to my warriors first. Price, to his credit, held his ground without flinching. I'll be filing for an emergency hearing, he said. 3 planetary rotations. I'd advise against leaving this moon before then. I leave when I leave, Commissioner. Price left with a promise of paperwork, and the paperwork arrived the next morning exactly as promised, thick, dense, and real, and Draven handed it off to a clerk without so much as opening the cover. The Khazrath came at sundown. A single rider on a Korak the color of wet ash, wearing colors Rennick wouldn't learn to recognize for another year, drove a black banner spike into the ground 3 paces from the compound's threshold, deep enough that it took two warriors' real effort to pull it free after the rider had already ridden off and left without a word. The pennant on the spike was a single strip of black cloth marked with a red triangle. The thestral in the compound went very quiet at the sight of it. Rennick, sitting up by then, asked Vesa what it meant. She told him the Khazrath had called a trial of 3 tides. It was their right under old law, and the Thren could not refuse it. The trial would be held in 9 days on the salt flats east of the compound. 3 contests: blade, mount, and will. Losing any one of them meant death. He asked who would be fighting. She looked at him for a long time before she answered. You will. He was 17. He had never held a real blade in his life, had never sat astride a karak, had no idea what a trial of will even meant in thestral custom. He had 9 days. He started that same night. The training ring behind the tents was a swept 40-pace circle lit by oil lamps mounted on iron stakes, and Vesa led him into it the very evening the trial was announced, carrying 2 practice blades, light curved, the wooden grips worn smooth by generations of other hands. She handed him one without preamble and told him to come at her. She put him on his back in under 2 seconds. She put him on his back 14 more times that same night and never once gloated, never once softened the lesson, just hauled him up by the wrist each time, reset him, and showed him exactly what he'd done wrong and exactly what she'd exploited. She told him he was strong but careless, fast but slow to read intent, that he kept watching the blade when the blade was always the last thing to move, and the shoulders were the first. By the 3rd night he was still losing every exchange, but losing them slower, and that was the only metric that mattered. The beast came to him on the 4th day. She'd been kept in a wide holding pen at the compound's southern edge, and the handlers had stopped entering it entirely after she broke one man's wrist for trying. Vesa walked Rennick to the fence at first light and told him to climb in alone. He did. The Korok lay in the far corner, flat black skull resting on her forelegs, old gold eyes tracking him the way a wary dog tracks an approaching stranger. He crossed the pen and stopped 3 paces off, hand extended, feeling absurd. She lowered her head and pressed it into his open palm. He sat down beside her in the dust. She rested her head on his thigh. He stayed there 2 hours, and when he finally rose to leave, she rose with him, followed him all the way to the training ring, and lay at its edge without moving while Vesa put him on his back another 19 times. The handlers gave up trying to reclaim her after that. From that day forward, she was rarely more than a few paces from him at any hour he was awake. The nights, oddly, were quieter than the days. On the 5th evening, seated with Vesa beside a brazier inside the Warlord's own tent, she told him about her brothers, 3 of them, all older, all dead. The eldest at the Battle of Torvex during the Kelvane Wars, the middle in a border skirmish against a clan that no longer existed. The youngest, only 4 years her senior, in a duel her father hadn't been able to stop, 8 months before Rennick had ever set foot on this moon. Her father, she said, hadn't spoken for a full season afterward. Hadn't slept indoors, hadn't eaten at the family table. The clan had genuinely believed, for a while, that they'd lost him along with his sons. She told him that the moment her father had pressed his palm to Rennick's chest in that tent, something had returned to his face that had been missing since her youngest brother's death. Rennick didn't know what to offer in return except the truth. He told her for the first time since a stranger in an intake office years earlier about the night his own parents died. The message that arrived past midnight. The way his father's voice had sounded when he recognized the wreckage on the report. His sentences came out shorter than he meant them to, because his throat kept closing on him. She didn't tell him she was sorry. She rested her hand on his bandaged shoulder and left it there, quiet, until he'd finished. They didn't kiss that night. They only leaned their foreheads together in the lamplight, while the beast at their feet made a sound close to a sigh. And outside, the wind off the dust flats began to rise, the same wind that would, by morning, carry the first banners of Khazrath's column over the eastern ridge. The salt flat lay 10 kilometers of bleached white ground, ringed by low red ridges dense with the silhouettes of 2,000 watching warriors, 1,000 from each clan. Behind them, a smaller crowd of human onlookers held back by colonial troopers under strict orders not to interfere. And overhead, 3 observer drones from the colonial authority hovered with blinking underlights recording everything. Khazrath himself didn't take the field for the first contest. Clan Law let him send 3 champions for blade and mount and reserve himself only for the final contest of will. He watched from a covered platform at the ring's eastern edge, a man in his mid-50s, deeper green than Draven, iron-black hair cropped short instead of braided, eyes the color of unpolished bronze that fixed on Rennick and never once looked elsewhere. Rennick stood at the western edge with Vesa at his side. The Korok he'd started calling her Ash for the color of her hide in low light at his back, and the curved practice blade he'd trained with for 9 days now sheathed at his hip. Draven stood to his left. "Your hands are shaking," the Warlord said quietly. "I know. Good. A man whose hands don't shake before a trial like this doesn't yet understand what's standing across from him. Let them shake. They'll stop when the work begins." The work began.
His first opponent was a Khazrath warrior twice his mass and a head taller, who crossed the ring like a man walking to claim a chair that already belonged to him. No bow, no words, just a draw that was itself the opening move. Rennick nearly died in the first 3 seconds. He didn't, because Vesa had taught him to watch the shoulders, and when the second cut came, the shoulders dropped a quarter second early, and Rennick was already moving before the blade finished its arc. He lost ground 3 times, took a shallow cut across his forearm that ran hot and fast down to his wrist, and kept moving anyway, because falling meant the trial ended in a way that ended everything else with it.
On the 7th exchange, his opponent's left shoulder dipped a fraction ahead of his right hand, the tell Rennick had been waiting 9 days to see, and he stepped inside the cut, drove his blade up under the guard and across the man's chest in a long, shallow line. Not deep enough. The man staggered back, looked down at the wet seam across his front, and pressed his palm flat to his own chest, the thestral gesture of yielding to kin. The crowd didn't cheer. They watched and measured and said nothing. The second contest was different, not a fight Rennick could win with his own hands at all. His opponent rode an older, heavier Karak named Garrick, veteran of 8 duels and undefeated in all of them. Rennick mounted Ash in the center of the ring. She'd let no other rider on her back since the day she'd bitten him, had only accepted him 7 days earlier, carrying him in slow, careful circles with her head held low. The horn sounded. Garrock came in like a dropped boulder. The 2 beasts met with a sound Rennick felt in his teeth, and what followed bore no resemblance to the blade contest that came before it. Savage, driving, the animals tearing at throats and driving hooked spurs into soft places between ribs. Ash took a long cut across her flank in the second exchange and nearly threw him with the lurch of it, then came back into the fight with a sound halfway between a roar and a scream. On the 3rd exchange, Garrock pinned her, forcing her down into the salt, his quartered jaws closing over her throat, not shut, but close enough that the 10-breath count of a formal yield had already begun in the crowd's collective silence. Rennick counted the first 3 breaths himself and didn't draw his blade. He leaned forward instead, chest to her shoulders, mouth close to the muscle behind her ear, and spoke her true name, the one Vesa had taught him on the 5th night, shaped with the exact breath and vowel length a human throat had never before attempted. Something went through Ash's entire body at the sound of it. She rose. Rennick hadn't known she could rise from that position. Garrock had the weight advantage, the pin, everything, but she rose anyway. His full weight still on her shoulders, and her head came up under his jaw, and her jaws closed on the soft place beneath his throat. Garrock made a sound no one in the ring had ever heard a Korok make before, and yielded. Ash held the closed bite 2 full heartbeats longer than required, a Korok's way of making a point, before releasing and carrying Rennick at a slow walk back to the western edge, blood still running freely from her flank, seemingly unbothered by it. The crowd this time made a sound of its own. Draven Thren brought his closed fist to his chest and held it there. The gesture rippled through both clans like current through still water, because it was the salute a warlord gave only to kin, and he was giving it to a 17-year-old human on the back of a bleeding beast in the middle of a salt-flat 30 light-years from where that boy had been born. The 3rd contest waited. Khazrath descended from his platform alone, no blade, no banner, and crossed the flat with his shadow stretched long behind him and his bronze eyes fixed on Rennick the entire way. Law permitted only 2 figures inside the trial circle once the final contest began, and the circle closed around him as he stepped into a fresh ring of white salt 12 paces across. There was no blade in a trial of will. No mount. 2 people, words, presence, silence, and the accumulated weight of every choice they'd ever made, and the first to step outside the white lost. Dying in a trial of will was rare. Breaking was common, and most who broke never fully came back from it, because a trial of will didn't cut the body. It cut the self, because Wrath had done this 7 times and won all 7. Most of his opponents older than Rennick was now. He studied the boy across the circle and didn't bother hiding that he was looking at a child. "You shouldn't be standing here," he said. 17 years old, not yet finished growing. The blade you carried in the first contest outweighed your own forearm. The beast that carried you in the second only carried you because she's bonded to you, not because you know how to ride her. You haven't earned the ground you're standing on. Rennick's foot shifted a fraction. He stopped it. The bond was charity. Wrath continued, patient, almost gentle, the tone of an old man instructing a grandchild. Draven Thren has buried 3 sons. 3. Boy. 1 at Torvex, 1 on the border, 1 in a duel on Kelvane he still wakes for in the night. I'm told. You filled an empty space in that man, because the space was there and open, and he couldn't stand to bury another empty cot. He didn't give you a name. He gave himself a reason to keep breathing. Rennick's hands began to shake, and the girl, Wrath said, letting the words hang a moment before continuing. 15 years old. The last living blood of the Iron Fist. She'll be a warlord's bride or a warlord in her own right inside 10 years. She bonded herself to you in a tent the day after a beast nearly killed her, in the only language her father ever gave her to speak with. She will outgrow you in 3 years' time, boy, and she will look at you across some hall somewhere, and she will not remember why she ever said yes. Rennick's mouth had gone dry. His weight had begun to lean, almost imperceptibly, toward the white line's edge, and Khazrath, who had done this 7 times, who knew exactly which small movements to watch for, delivered his next words with the precision of a blade finding a gap in armor. Your parents were killed by insurgents, he said. You were 11, I'm told. Your father's name was Aiden. Your mother's, Coretta. The transport route they took that day ran through contested border space, and the faction that placed the charge on that transport's hull was funded, I understand, by a sympathetic clan. The ring, the crowd, the sky itself all seemed to recede at once. Funded by a clan, boy. Green-skinned, white-haired, a clan whose warlord sat in a stone hall on Kelvane that very morning and put his seal on the order. I won't tell you which clan. A pause deliberate. I will tell you that the man you now call father has, across a very long career, sent men into contested border sectors more times than either of us could count. I will tell you that the tent you sleep in tonight belongs to the people who put your mother's photograph into a stranger's hands at your own front door. Vesa at the ring's edge made a small broken sound that escaped her before she could stop it. Rennick heard it. Draven beside her didn't move. A trial of will permitted no aid from outside the circle, but his amber eyes had gone very still, fixed entirely on his son. Rennick closed his eyes. The white salt fell away behind them, and the crowd fell away, and the wind fell away, and what remained in that private dark was a kitchen at 3 in the morning on a moon whose name he tried hard to forget. And his mother's hands frozen mid-gesture in a photograph, and the specific sound his father had made recognizing the wreckage report on the screen. He let himself sit with that sound for the first time in 6 years. Then, unbidden, a second memory rose over it, a green hand closing on his sleeve in a crowded market, a careful, formal apology in a language not her own, a beast the size of a horse rounding a corner, and a boy who hadn't thought twice before stepping into its path. A warlord kneeling in the dust, tasting blood from a stranger's shoulder, going still with recognition. A palm pressed flat over a heartbeat. He opened his eyes. The salt flat was still there. Khazrath was still there, watching him, and the patience on the old warrior's face had gained a thin, uncertain edge, because the boy across from him had shut his eyes for 30 full seconds and hadn't stepped out. Rennick spoke. You're right about one thing. His voice came out rough, and he let it stay that way. I'm a boy. I was a boy when insurgents killed my parents. I was a boy for 6 years after that, mucking stalls in a loft above pack animals for wages that barely covered my own gloves. I was a boy yesterday morning. Khazrath waited. I stopped being one when something the size of a horse closed its jaws on my ribs and I chose not to fall. He let that sit. You came here today to break a boy, because if you break me, then the venom didn't really choose me. The beast bond doesn't mean anything. The warlord's hand on my chest was sentiment, not truth. You need all of that to be true, because the alternative is worse for you. Something flickered across Khosrath's expression. His foot moved half an inch. He caught it, reset it, and Rennick saw the catch happen. "You're afraid," Rennick said, "of what it means that a human survived that bite? Because if a human can carry the Var Ash, then the line your people have spent generations drawing between Thesral and everyone else was never as solid as you needed it to be. And it's already washing out in the eyes of every warrior from both clans standing at the edge of this ring right now, who watched a human ride a Karak through the second trial and rise from a pin no one alive has ever risen from. It's washing out in front of the drones broadcasting this to a Federation hearing room. It's washing out in your own people's tents tonight, in the eyes of Thesral, who came here expecting to see something they'd been taught to despise, and instead saw something they were never taught to expect at all." He took a breath. "You didn't come here to defend your clan from my bond, Khosrath. You came here to find out, with your own eyes, whether the line was really dissolving." "Now you know." Khosrath's foot moved again fully this time, without his permission, his shoulder turning with it. His bronze eyes losing every trace of the patience he'd carried into the circle. He reached for a response and found nothing there to reach for. He stepped backward, out across the white line, without a word of formal yield, because none was needed. His warriors closed around him in silence and walked him back to the platform without a single look toward his own sons. Rennick stood alone in the circle, swayed once, and stayed standing. Ash reached the ring's edge at a slow walk, her bandaged flank dark and dried, her old gold eyes locked on her rider. Vesa arrived with one hand pressed flat to her own chest. Dreventhren stood with both hands loose at his sides, and the boy walked out of the white circle on his own legs, crossing to all three of them in order: his bonded first, his kin second, his father third. At the ring's far edge, Commissioner Price lowered the control unit for his observer drone. He'd captured the entire trial on record, and he understood, with total clarity, exactly what that footage was going to show the emergency hearing board in 3 days' time, and exactly how thin his extraction case had just become. He turned without a word, walked back to his transport, and never filed it. The Thren clan hold stood carved into the eastern cliffs of Kelvane, stone and dark timber, built into the rock face itself, home to the Iron Fist's line for 9 generations. 6 months after the trial of Three Tides, a young man stood on a high ledge above the hold's main gate as the heavy red sun of that world climbed slow over a horizon made entirely of stone. A Karak the size of a small horse stood at his side. A green-skinned girl with a single white braid leaned into his good shoulder. He'd grown 2 fingers taller, by Vesa's exact measurement, broader through the shoulders from months in the hold's training yards. The silver arc of scar running from his collarbone down across his ribs had settled the way old wounds settle, a ridge he no longer felt as pain, but still noticed whenever he turned a certain way. Vesa traced it sometimes in the dark, without either of them mentioning it. He was learning the language badly. He could greet a division captain without giving offense and still couldn't get through a children's primer unassisted. He was learning the law under the tutelage of a 90-year-old clan advocate with no patience and flawless standard, who told him 2 months in that he was the worst student she'd ever taught, and in the same breath, the fastest reader. Ash slept at the foot of his cot every night and growled at anyone who came too close, including on 3 separate occasions, Dreventhren himself, which the Warlord found funnier than Rennick had seen him find almost anything else in 6 months. The dawn on the ledge was quiet. Vesa, cheek against his shoulder, said, "You're thinking again." "I am. You think too much. You taught me to read shoulders." "A man's got to think about something while he does it." She made the small sound that passed for her as laughter, and he felt it through the fabric of his shirt where her cheek rested. He thought, not for the first time, that he hadn't understood a person could become a place you actually lived in, not until he'd started living in her. He thought about the loft above the pack animals, about cracked gloves and a flat dust basin. He'd looked at every dawn for 6 years without once really seeing it, about 2 buckets of water and a black drape wagon rolling through an eastern gate on an ordinary morning that turned out not to be ordinary at all. He thought about everything the Warlord had given him: a name, a daughter in the only sense the law allowed, a beast bonded for life, a father of a kind he'd stopped believing he'd ever have again, and a scar that would never fully fade. And he thought about what he'd given in return. He'd given a stranger his back. That was the whole of it. He'd stepped between a monster and a girl he'd known for 11 minutes. In a market on a moon he'd been sick of for years, and every single thing that followed the bond, the trial, the name, the clan hold. The life he was standing inside right now had unspooled from one motion of his body that had taken him less time than a single heartbeat to complete. Vesa asked, quietly, what he was thinking about. He told her he was thinking he'd spent 6 years a ghost in a place that never wanted him. And that one ordinary morning in the sun, he'd stood between a beast and a girl and stopped being a ghost the moment he did. She was quiet a long moment, and what are you now? He thought about it as the light climbed fully over the ridge, catching silver on the scar at his shoulder, catching gold on the new fourth strand woven into the leather charm at her wrist, a knot that no longer read as name unfinished, catching on the broad black plates of Ash's skull, whose old gold eyes hadn't closed once since dawn had started. I'm where I belong, he said. Ash made a sound against his leg that wasn't quite a sigh. Vesa laughed, the small private version she saved only for him, and turned her face up toward his. And somewhere behind him, 30 light years and 6 months removed, a warlord's voice from inside a tent came back to him one more time. Blood of the Thren line, brother to no man living, son to Draven, free of debt to all clans under Kelvain's banner. The boy who had taken a beast's jaws to keep a stranger alive, who had given his back without a single second of thought, leaned down and kissed the girl bonded to him for the first time, and the wide red sun over Kelvain kept climbing, unhurried. The way it always had, the way it always would, over a hold that was now, in every way that mattered, his home. The story doesn't end at the top of that ledge. It just quiets down for a while, the way real lives do between the moments worth telling. But quiet on a border moon never lasts as long as anyone wants it to. And what came next taught Rennick that surviving a trial was never the same thing as being safe. Word of the trial of Three Tides didn't stay contained to 2 clans and a handful of colonial troopers for long. Recordings from the observer drones leaked within a week. Nobody in the Thren hold ever confirmed who'd released them, though Rennick had his suspicions about a certain 90-year-old advocate with a taste for making a point, and by the second month, footage of a human boy riding a bonded Karak through a pinned yield and talking a 7-time champion out of a trial circle had made its way across 3 systems worth of news feeds. The Federation Senate, which had spent a generation treating the Thestral Treaty as a fragile thing to be managed quietly and kept off the front page, suddenly found itself fielding public questions it had never prepared answers for. If a human could survive the Varash, if a human could be recognized as clan blood under Thestral law, if the line everyone had built careers and policies around was really as solid as they'd always assumed, Draven Thren didn't seem troubled by any of it. He seemed, if anything, entertained, the closest thing to entertain Rennick had yet seen out of him, which mostly expressed itself as a slightly longer pause before he dismissed each new envoy who arrived at the Hold's gate requesting statements, interviews, or clarifications. Let them ask their questions to the salt flat, he told Rennick once, watching a courier's transport lift off empty-handed. The salt flat already answered them, but not everyone found the footage entertaining. Word came in the 4th month, carried by a trader who'd overheard it 3 systems over, that a faction within the Khazrath clan, younger warriors, mostly men who hadn't been on the Salt Flat that day and hadn't watched their warlord's foot cross the white line with their own eyes, considered the outcome of the trial illegitimate. Some kind of trick, they said. A human couldn't out-argue a 7-time champion of the will. There had to be interference. Some of them were saying the Varash itself had been tampered with, that Rennick's survival was manufactured rather than earned, engineered by a Thren medic loyal enough to falsify a miracle for the sake of embarrassing a rival clan. Vesa heard the rumor first from a cousin who'd heard it from a merchant, and she brought it to Rennick on the training grounds with her jaw set in a way he'd learned meant she was already 3 moves ahead of whatever came next. They're saying it wasn't real, she told him, not bothering to soften it, that my father staged it. Rennick lowered the practice blade he'd been working a drill with, real drills now, not the desperate 9-day cram session from 6 months earlier, but the slow, patient repetition of someone building a skill instead of scrambling to survive one test of it. Staged how? I've got the scar. Scars can be made. That's what they're saying. Not that they believe it, she added, before he could ask. Most of them don't. But belief isn't really the point for men like that. The point is having a reason loud enough to justify what they already wanted to do. And what did they already want to do? She didn't answer right away, which told him more than an answer would have. The answer arrived 9 days later in the form of a raiding party that hit a Thren grain caravan on the low road between the Hold and Castaway Station. 11 wagons, 4 dead handlers, and a message left burned into the side of the lead wagon in Thestral script that Vesa translated for him with her voice gone flat and careful in the way it went when she was working hard to keep it from doing something else. The line was never washed away, it was only hidden. We will find it again. Draven Thren read the translation once, standing in the compound's central yard with the burned wagon still smoldering behind the messenger who'd ridden 3 days straight to deliver the news, and then he did something Rennick hadn't seen him do before. He looked for one unguarded moment, tired, not the calculated stillness he wore in negotiations, not the patient weight he carried into every room like a second skin, but something closer to a man doing arithmetic he already knew the answer to and didn't like. "This is not sanctioned by Kazrath's seat," he said finally. He would not risk open war over rumor. This is the faction acting on its own account, testing whether their warlord has the will to discipline them for it. "And if he doesn't?" Rennick asked. "Then I will have to discipline them myself, and that will look to anyone watching from a distance, exactly like the War Commissioner Price was so worried about 6 months ago." Draven's amber eyes moved to Rennick and something in them sharpened. "You understand what this means for you specifically?" Rennick did, though he would have preferred not to. If the raiding faction's grievance was that his survival delegitimized the trial, then the fastest way to undo the grievance, in the ugly, practical logic of men who solved problems with raiding parties, was to undo the survivor. "They come for me," he said. "It's not really about me." "No," Draven agreed. "It rarely is. But you will still be the one standing in the doorway when they arrive, and I intend for you to still be standing there afterward as well." What followed wasn't a second trial. There was no formal ring, no salt flat, no 2,000 watching warriors keeping a fair accounting of blows given and taken. It was 3 weeks of a hold on quiet alert, patrols doubled, Ash rarely more than an arm's length from Rennick at any hour, and Vesa sleeping when she slept at all, with a blade within reach of her hand for the first time since he'd known her. It was the kind of tension that didn't announce itself with drums or banners, just sat low in the walls of the compound like weather building somewhere just past the visible horizon. It broke on a night with no moon at all, which Rennick would later understand was not a coincidence. The raiding faction had chosen their timing with the same care Draven chose his, just aimed at a different outcome. Ash woke him before any human sentry raised an alarm, her head coming up off the floor of his quarters with a low sound in her throat that had nothing sleepy left in it. And by the time he'd pulled on boots and grabbed the blade, Vesa's people had finally trusted him to carry unsupervised. The compound's outer bell was already ringing. They came over the southern wall in a group small enough to move quiet and large enough to do real damage if they weren't stopped fast. 12 riders, maybe fewer. Koroks painted dark to blend with the night, moving with the kind of discipline that told Rennick immediately these weren't hot-blooded young warriors acting on impulse. Someone had trained them for exactly this. He found Vesa already in the courtyard when he made it there, blade in hand, her white braid whipping loose in the wind, kicked up by the beast circling overhead on the wall's parapet. And for one strange suspended second, he thought about the girl who'd caught his sleeve in a market plaza 6 months earlier, scared and lost and careful with her standard, and understood with total clarity that she did not exist anymore, hadn't. Maybe for longer than either of them had let themselves admit. The woman standing in the courtyard directing warriors twice her age with short, clipped commands in a language that had stopped sounding foreign to him weeks ago was someone new, someone the trial and the raid and every quiet hour in between had built out of the girl he'd first met. The same slow way 6 years on Castaway Station had built him out of the boy who'd lost his parents at 11. "They're not here for the hold," she called to him over the noise, falling in beside him as the first riders dropped from the wall into the yard. "They're here for you specifically. Stay close to Ash. Let her do what she was made to do." He didn't get much chance to argue the point. The fighting that followed wasn't the clean, ritualized exchange of the salt flat. No formal yields, no 10-breath counts, just close, ugly chaos in the dark with beasts screaming and blades catching torchlight and flashes too quick to track. Rennick found himself fighting the way he'd trained for months to fight, watching shoulders instead of blades, and it kept him alive through the first 2 exchanges in a way that would have been impossible 6 months earlier. Ash tore through the yard beside him like something unleashed rather than ridden, and more than once he felt the strange, wordless certainty of the bond telling him where she was even when he couldn't see her, the same way he'd learned to feel Vesa's presence at his back without needing to check. The raid broke inside 20 minutes, not because the attackers were beaten so much as because Thren arrived at the head of the hold's full garrison, and the sight of the Iron Fist himself wading into the yard, calm and terrible and entirely unhurried, even in the middle of a night raid, did more to end the fighting than any single blow landed by anyone else. The surviving raiders broke and ran for the wall they'd come over, and the hold let most of them go, because Draven had already decided, apparently before the raid had even fully started, that killing them all would only hand the young Khazrath faction the martyrs it wanted. 3 of them didn't make it back over the wall. One of the 3, wounded and cornered against the granary before he could climb, turned out to be a lieutenant in the Khazrath Warlord's own honor guard. Proof, when Draven's advocate laid it out cold and precise in front of a hastily convened council 2 days later, that this hadn't been rogue young men acting entirely alone. Someone with real standing had known, or at minimum had chosen not to know too closely. And either way, the responsibility climbed higher up the Khazrath chain than faction of Hutheads could comfortably explain away. Khazrath himself came to the Threnhold 12 days later, without banners, without a column of warriors, riding alone the same way his messenger had ridden alone 6 months before to plant the trial spike in the ground. Rennick watched him arrive from the same high ledge where he and Vesa had stood counting scars and sunrises months earlier, and felt something in his chest go tight and wary in a way that surprised him, not fear. Exactly, but the specific unease of watching a man who had once tried to unmake him with words alone walk back into range to try something else. He needn't have worried, not in the way he expected. Khazrath dismounted in the central yard, unarmed, and asked, not demanded, asked for an audience with Thren, and when it was granted, he did something Rennick hadn't imagined the man capable of on the Salt Flat 6 months earlier. He knelt.
The lieutenant acted with knowledge I permitted myself not to examine too closely. Khazrath said, in front of enough witnesses, that the admission couldn't later be walked back or denied. That failure is mine, not my clan's alone, and I will not hide behind the excuse of youth or hot blood for men old enough to know exactly what orders they were carrying out. I offer what recompense the law allows, and I offer it to the boy directly, since it was the boy's life the raid was meant to end. Rennick, summoned down to the yard for the accounting, stood beside Vesa and Draven, and found himself, for the first time since the Salt Flat, on the receiving end of Khazrath's full attention with nothing between them but open air.
You told me on the flat that I came looking to see whether the line had really washed away, Khazrath said, and there was none of the old patient condescension left in it. I have come back to tell you that I found my answer somewhere I did not expect to find it, in my own honor guard, in a lieutenant who could not accept what his own eyes had witnessed and chose violence instead of acceptance. The line is not washing away because of you, boy. It is washing away because men like him cannot bear to watch it happen and do nothing. That is a different failure than the one I accused you of, and it is mine to answer for, not yours. It wasn't quite an apology. Rennick understood, by then, that a man like Khazrath probably didn't have a full apology in him, not for anyone, and certainly not delivered in front of witnesses from 2 clans, but it was close enough to one that Draven accepted the recompense offered, a formal accounting, reparations to the caravan handlers' families, and a public acknowledgement before both clans that the trial of 3 Tides had stood and would continue to stand exactly as decided on the Salt Flat 6 months prior. No revision, no asterisks, no quiet erosion of what had actually happened that day. Khazrath left the same way he'd arrived, alone, unbannered, and Rennick watched him go from the same high ledge and found that whatever grim satisfaction he might have expected to feel at watching his old opponent kneel didn't really arrive. What arrived instead was something quieter and more useful. The understanding that the line Khazrath kept talking about wasn't a single wall that either held or broke all at once.
It was made of 1,000 small moments like this one, decisions made or failed by individual people who either could or couldn't bear what they were witnessing, and it would keep needing defending in small, ugly increments for as a year to the day after the market plaza, after the beast and the bite and the tent full of incense and impossible words. Rennick stood again on the high ledge above the Threnhold's gate and found that the view hadn't changed, but he had. Vesa found him there the way she always did, without announcing herself, simply arriving at his shoulder like she'd never been anywhere else.
She was 16 now, taller by another finger's width. The circlet she wore at formal occasions traded that morning for a simpler braid, because the anniversary the clan had taken to calling it the Threndai, the day of the taking in, and had apparently decided somewhere along the way, without consulting either of them, that it deserved its own small yearly ceremony, called for something less ornamental and more honest. You're thinking again. She said exactly the way she had a year and a lifetime ago. I am. He looked out over the ridge, where Ash lay stretched in the morning sun below the ledge, her flank scar long since healed to a pale seam against black scale. I keep doing the math on it. One morning, 2 buckets of water. If Osgood had sent me to the west stables instead of the east that day, none of this happens. Maybe, Vessa said. Or maybe it happens a different way, on a different morning, because that's simply who you are, and the universe kept finding excuses to prove it to both of us. She leaned into his shoulder, the old familiar weight of it. My father says something similar, when he thinks I'm not listening closely enough to catch him being sentimental. He says the Varash doesn't create a Venari. It only reveals one that was already there, waiting for a beast's jaws to prove it. Rennick thought about the boy in the loft above the pack animals. The half-credit wages, the cracked gloves, 6 years of quietly deciding that expecting nothing from anyone was the safest way to survive a world that had already taken everything from him once. He thought about how easy it would have been in that half-second in the market plaza to hesitate, to let instinct calculate the odds the way 6 years of hard-won caution had trained him to calculate everything else, and step back instead of forward. He hadn't hesitated. He still didn't fully understand why, except that some decisions, it turned out, weren't decisions at all so much as the simple shape of a person finally showing itself under pressure. The way a bone sets when it heals, not because you chose the shape, but because the shape was always going to be there once the break forced it into view. "I'm glad Osgood sent me east that morning," he said finally. Vessa laughed, the small private version, and below them Ash lifted her broad flat skull and looked up at the ledge with old gold eyes that hadn't closed, as far as Rennick could ever tell, on a single sunrise since the day she'd first bitten him and changed the whole shape of both their lives. The red sun kept climbing over Kelvane, the way it always did, unhurried, indifferent to the particular story unfolding beneath it, and Rennick Doyle, once a ghost in a stable loft on a moon that never wanted him, stood in the place he'd chosen without choosing it, and found, a full year on, that the answer to Vessa's oldest question hadn't changed at all. He was exactly where he belonged.